The summer heat bore down on Pine Street as Officer David Reynolds drove his patrol car through the neighborhood, the AC barely keeping up with the sweltering afternoon. The dashboard clock read 4:30 p.m., and the streets were coming alive with kids returning from school, their backpacks and laughter dotting the sidewalks. Reynolds had been on the force for 8 years, and this neighborhood was as familiar to him as his own reflection in the rearview mirror. He knew every corner store owner, every crossing guard, and most of the regulars who hung out at the community basketball court. Today felt different, though. There was an edge to the air that he couldn't quite place. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, the rhythmic sound of a basketball hitting concrete caught his attention. The community court was packed today more than usual. A group of teenagers was playing a heated game, their energy electric and contagious. Among them was a tall young man, maybe 17 or 18, moving with the grace of someone who'd spent countless hours perfecting his game. Reynolds pulled over, not because there was any real problem, but because Mrs. Wilson from the apartment complex nearby had called in about noise. It was a routine check, the kind he'd done hundreds of times before. He stepped out of his car, straightening his uniform in the humid air. "Afternoon, folks," he called out, his voice carrying across the court. The game slowly came to a stop, the basketball's bounce echoing to silence. The tall teenager who'd been leading the game turned to face him, still catching his breath from the play. "Everything all right, officer?" the young man asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. He was wearing a blue jersey with the number 23, his hands raised slightly in a natural gesture. "Just got a noise complaint," Reynolds replied, taking a few steps closer. The atmosphere shifted subtly, like a cloud passing over the sun. Other players began reaching for their phones. A natural reaction these days when law enforcement showed up. The young man reached for his back pocket, saying, "We're just playing ball, officer. I can show you the court permit." But something in that movement, maybe it was the heat, maybe it was the tension in the air, maybe it was the memories of recent incidents that had everyone on edge, made Reynolds react. In a split second, his hand went to his belt, and before anyone could blink, he pulled out his pepper spray. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice sharper than he'd intended. "What?" "I'm just getting my phone," the teenager started to explain, his voice steady despite the situation. But it was too late. Reynolds had already pressed the trigger. The spray hit the young man directly in the face. The effect was immediate and devastating. He dropped to his knees, crying out in pain, his hands covering his eyes. The other players scattered, some filming with their phones, others calling for help. As the teenager arrived on the ground, Reynolds stood frozen, his hands still gripping the pepper spray. The world seemed to slow down around him. He could hear shouts from the gathering crowd, the sound of running feet, and phones ringing. But most of all, he could hear the young man's labored breathing and painful coughs. In that moment, looking at what he'd done, Reynolds felt something inside him crack. The teenager on the ground wasn't just another face on his patrol, he was somebody's son, somebody's friend, somebody's brother. And Reynolds had just made a terrible mistake. The crowd was growing larger now. Someone had brought water to help flush the young man's eyes. Phones were pointed at the scene from every direction, capturing what had happened. Reynolds could hear sirens in the distance, probably responding to multiple 911 calls about the incident. Standing there, watching the aftermath of his split-second decision, Reynolds began to realize that this moment would change everything, for him, for the young man on the ground, and for their entire community. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him harder than the summer heat ever could. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about being a police officer, about his community, and about himself. The real test wasn't in what had just happened, it was in what would happen next, in the next few hours that would change both their lives forever. The chaos that followed seemed to move in slow motion. The young man was still on the ground, his hands covering his face as tears streamed down his cheeks from the burning spray. Around him, the crowd had grown from a handful of basketball players to what felt like the whole neighborhood. The air was thick with tension and the sound of voices, some angry, some frightened, all concerned. An older woman pushed through the crowd, her gray hair tied back in a neat bun. She was wearing scrubs, obviously just getting off her shift at the local hospital. "I'm a nurse," she called out, her voice calm but firm. "Let me help." She knelt beside the teenager, her experienced hands already reaching for the water bottle someone had brought over. Officer Reynolds watched, rooted to the spot, as the nurse helped the young man tilt his head back. "Blink, sweetheart," she instructed gently. "Let the water wash it out. That's it, keep blinking." Her calm presence seemed to lower the temperature of the whole situation, that her phones were still recording every moment. From somewhere in the crowd, a young girl's voice cut through the tension. "That's my brother." A small figure pushed through the adults, and Reynolds felt his heart sink even further. She couldn't have been more than 12, wearing a backpack covered in cartoon stickers. The look of fear and confusion on her face as she saw her big brother in pain was like a physical blow to Reynolds' chest. The nurse looked up at Reynolds, and something flickered across her face. Recognition. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice carrying a mix of surprise and disappointment. "I treated your mother last month at County General, remember? The hip surgery." The words hit Reynolds like a bucket of cold water. Suddenly, this wasn't just another incident on his patrol. These were people connected to his life, his community. The nurse who'd helped his mother through a difficult recovery was now helping a young man he'd just pepper-sprayed for reaching for his phone. More sirens were approaching now. The teenager's breathing had steadied somewhat, though his eyes were still red and swollen. He managed to sit up, supported by his sister on one side and the nurse on the other. Despite his obvious pain, there was a dignity in how he held himself that made Reynolds' shame even deeper. "Man, I was just trying to show you the permit," the teenager said, his voice hoarse. "We got permission to use the court till 6, been doing this program with the kids all summer." He gestured weakly toward a backpack near the court, where Reynolds could now see several official-looking papers sticking out. The little sister spoke up, her voice trembling but determined. "He runs the youth program here. Teaches the little kids basketball every Tuesday and Thursday. Everybody knows him." Her words carried an accusation that cut deeper than any angry shout could have. By now, an ambulance had arrived, its lights painting the scene in rotating red and white. 2 paramedics emerged, carrying their equipment. The crowd parted to let them through, but nobody left. This was their neighborhood, their people, and they weren't going anywhere until they knew everything would be okay. As the paramedics began their assessment, Reynolds noticed something that made his blood run cold. The teenager's jersey wasn't just any basketball uniform. It had "Community Youth Leader" printed across the back, along with the city's official recreation department logo. This was someone who was actually working with the city, trying to make the neighborhood better. The nurse was speaking quietly to the paramedics, giving them details about the pepper spray exposure and her initial treatment. The little sister had pulled out her phone, her fingers flying as she presumably texted their parents. The crowd continued to record everything, their phones like dozens of silent witnesses to this moment gone horribly wrong. Reynolds felt his own phone vibrating in his pocket, probably his supervisor calling after getting reports of the incident. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak. He watched as the paramedics helped the teenager onto a stretcher, his sister still clutching his hand. The nurse gathered their belongings, carefully folding the court permit and placing it in the backpack. Someone in the crowd started talking about how this would go viral, how the whole world would see what happened here today. But Reynolds wasn't thinking about viral videos or social media. He was thinking about how quickly trust could be broken, how one moment of fear or prejudice could undo years of community building. The ambulance doors closed with a final heavy thud. As it pulled away, its sirens mercifully silent, Reynolds noticed the basketball still sitting abandoned on the court. It had rolled to a stop against the fence, a silent reminder of how differently this afternoon could have gone. The nurse approached him one last time before leaving. "You know," she said quietly, "healing isn't just about treating wounds. Sometimes it's about facing our mistakes and doing better." With that, she walked away, leaving Reynolds alone with his thoughts and the weight of what would come next. As the ambulance disappeared around the corner, Officer Reynolds walked slowly back to his patrol car, the weight of the situation pressing down on his shoulders. The crowd had thinned but hadn't disappeared entirely. Small groups stood talking in hushed voices, some still recording with their phones, others shaking their heads in disappointment. He sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, not yet turning the key. The air conditioning hummed softly, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. That's when he noticed the basketball jersey again in his mind. Something about it had seemed familiar, but in the heat of the moment, he hadn't placed it. The teenager had been wearing a blue jersey with Thompson Community Center printed across it. Thompson. The name hit him like a thunderbolt. Could it be the same Thompson? He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and searched for the community center's website. There it was. The community center was named after retired police captain Richard Thompson, one of the city's first black police officers, and Reynolds felt his stomach drop, his own mentor from the police academy. The same man who had taught him about community policing, about building trust, about seeing people first and uniform second. Captain Thompson had been the one who'd helped Reynolds through his roughest days as a rookie cop. "The badge isn't a shield to hide behind," he used to say. "It's a bridge to connect with your community." And now, Reynolds had just pepper-sprayed his mentor's grandson. The realization made him feel physically ill. He remembered all those long talks with Captain Thompson, sitting in the patrol car during ride-alongs, learning not just about police work but about life, about treating everyone with dignity regardless of circumstances. The captain had believed in him, had seen something in him worth nurturing. Through his windshield, Reynolds watched as the last few people left the basketball court. A group of younger kids who must have been part of the youth program stood huddled together, picking up their belongings. One small boy carefully placed the basketball back in the equipment bag, his movements slow and uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he'd be allowed to play here again. Reynolds' phone buzzed again. A text from his supervisor. "Report to the station immediately." But he couldn't move yet. His eyes were fixed on the community center's sign across the street. How many times had he driven past it without making the connection? How many times had Captain Thompson told stories about his grandson, carrying on his legacy of community service in his own way? The memories came flooding back. Captain Thompson standing proud at his retirement ceremony, talking about his hopes for the future. It's not about us versus them. It's just us. All of us together. He had dedicated his life to breaking down barriers, and in one thoughtless moment, Reynolds had built them right back up. A knock on his window startled him. It was the nurse from earlier. Reynolds rolled down his window, expecting anger, but her face showed something closer to concern. "You know," she said, leaning slightly down to meet his eyes, "Captain Thompson used to bring his grandson here every weekend when he was little. Taught him everything about basketball and community service. That boy practically grew up on this court, helping younger kids just like his grandfather helped young officers." Reynolds felt his eyes burning. "I didn't know," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe that's part of the problem," she replied gently. "We don't always take the time to know the people we're supposed to protect and serve. But it's never too late to learn." She straightened up and adjusted her bag. "The boy's parents will be at the hospital by now. They're good people. His mother runs the community center's youth programs. His father teaches at the high school. They've spent their lives building bridges in this community." She paused, letting her words sink in. "What you do next matters more than what you did back there." As she walked away, Reynolds finally turned the key in the ignition. The captain's words echoed in his head. The true measure of an officer isn't in how they handle their best moments, but in how they handle their mistakes. The drive to the station felt like the longest of his career. Every street corner seemed to hold a memory. Places where Captain Thompson had taught him something valuable, places where he'd helped community members, places where he'd felt proud to wear the badge. Now, each memory came with a fresh sting of shame. He pulled into the station parking lot, knowing that what waited inside wouldn't be easy. There would be reports to file, investigations to face, consequences to deal with. But before all that, he had a more important stop to make. He needed to go to the hospital, not as an officer following procedure, but as a person owning up to his mistakes. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Reynolds sat for one more moment, gathering his courage. The easy thing would be to follow procedure, file the paperwork, let the system handle it. But he could almost hear Captain Thompson's voice. Easy isn't always right, and right isn't always easy. With a deep breath, he stepped out of his car. The path ahead was clear, even if it wouldn't be simple. It was time to start rebuilding those bridges, one difficult step at a time. The hospital parking lot was filling up with the evening shift change when Officer Reynolds arrived. He'd stopped at home first to change into civilian clothes. Somehow, wearing the uniform right now felt wrong. His department-issued phone had been buzzing nonstop, but he'd silenced it. Some things were more important than procedure. Inside the emergency room, the fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and unreal. The waiting room was half full, and Reynolds spotted several faces from the basketball court earlier. They recognized him too. He could tell by how conversations suddenly stopped and eyes followed his movement. A man in a neatly pressed shirt and tie stood up as Reynolds approached the reception desk. Even without an introduction, Reynolds knew this must be the teenager's father. The way he carried himself, proud but tired, angry but controlled, spoke volumes. "Officer Reynolds," the father said, not as a greeting but as a statement. "I've seen you patrol our neighborhood for years. Never thought we'd meet like this." Reynolds felt the weight of those words. "Sir, my son," the father continued, his voice steady but tight with emotion, "has spent every summer since he was 14 running youth programs at that court. Every summer. He's helped dozens of kids stay out of trouble, learn teamwork, build confidence. Now they all saw him face down on the concrete because he reached for his phone." Each word hit like a physical blow. Reynolds noticed the father's hands. They were shaking slightly, though his voice remained calm. This was a man used to keeping his composure, probably from years of teaching high school students, but right now that composure was being tested to its limits. "The doctor says his eyes will heal," the father continued. "The burning will stop. The swelling will go down. But what about the other damage? What about those kids who watched it happen? What about my daughter who saw her brother?" His voice finally cracked, just slightly. Reynolds felt tears welling up in his own eyes. "I made a terrible mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I reacted without thinking, without seeing. I forgot everything I was taught about being a police officer, about being a human being." Just then, a nurse called out to the father. His son was asking for him. The father turned to go, then paused. "You know what hurts the most," he said. "My son still wants to believe in the system. Even now, he's in there talking about how this could be a chance for positive change. That's who he is, who we raised him to be. He's a better person than this situation deserves." Reynolds watched the father walk away, disappearing behind the emergency room doors. He sank into one of the hard plastic chairs, putting his head in his hands. The events of the day played over and over in his mind, every wrong choice, every missed opportunity to handle things differently. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from Captain Thompson himself. "We need to talk." The retired captain must have heard what happened. The shame Reynolds felt deepened even further. How could he face his mentor after this? A small TV mounted in the corner was playing the local news. Reynolds looked up just in time to see footage from the incident. Someone's cell phone video was already making headlines. The caption read, "Local youth leader pepper sprayed by police officer at community basketball court." The waiting room had grown quieter. Reynolds could feel eyes on him, could hear whispered conversations. Some people were watching the news footage, then looking back at him. His instinct was to leave, to escape the judgment and shame, but he forced himself to stay. Running away wouldn't fix anything. The teenager's little sister emerged from the emergency room, presumably to get something from the vending machine. When she saw Reynolds, she stopped. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something else there too, a question, maybe, or a challenge. "He teaches the little kids to trust police officers, you know," she said, her young voice carrying across the quiet waiting room. "Tells them that if they're ever in trouble, they can ask an officer for help. What's he supposed to tell them now?" Before Reynolds could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving her question hanging in the air. It was a question that demanded an answer, not just from him, but from every officer who wore the badge. Time seemed to move differently in the waiting room. Reynolds lost track of how long he sat there, watching people come and go, feeling the weight of what he'd done settle deeper into his bones. His phone had finally stopped buzzing. Either his supervisor had given up or was planning something more serious. Outside, the sun had set completely. Through the hospital windows, Reynolds could see the city lights coming on, one by one. Somewhere out there, the basketball court stood empty, the scene of his biggest failure as an officer. But here he sat, knowing that leaving wasn't an option. Not until he faced what he'd done, not until he took the first step toward making it right, if that was even possible. The emergency room doors opened again. This time it was the mother, her face showing the strain of the day, but her eyes clear and focused. She walked directly to where Reynolds sat and for a moment just looked at him. Then she spoke, her words careful and measured. "My son wants to talk to you. Are you ready to listen?" Reynolds stood up slowly, his legs feeling unsteady. Was he ready? Could anyone be ready for a conversation like this? But he knew there was only one answer he could give. "Yes, ma'am. I'm ready to listen." Following the mother through the emergency room doors felt like walking into another world. The harsh fluorescent lights made everything look too bright, too real. Each step down the corridor echoed with the weight of what was about to happen. Reynolds could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The teenager was sitting up in the hospital bed, his eyes still red and swollen but looking better than before. His basketball jersey had been replaced with a hospital gown, making him look younger somehow, more vulnerable. But there was strength in how he held himself, a quiet dignity that made Reynolds feel even smaller. "Officer Reynolds," the teenager said, his voice still slightly hoarse. "Thanks for coming." The simple courtesy in those words, after everything that had happened, hit harder than any anger could have. The room felt crowded, even though there were only 5 people in it: the teenager, his parents, Reynolds, and a hospital social worker who sat quietly in the corner, observing. The beeping of medical monitors created a steady rhythm in the background. "I owe you more than an apology," Reynolds started, his voice shaking slightly. "What I did was wrong. Completely wrong. There's no excuse." The teenager nodded slowly. "You know what's crazy?" he said, looking directly at Reynolds. "Just yesterday, I was telling the kids in my program that police officers are here to protect us. That if they're ever scared or in trouble, they can trust an officer to help them." He paused, letting out a small, pained laugh. "Guess I need to update that lesson plan." His father put a hand on his shoulder, but the teenager continued. "I've been running that youth program for 3 years now. 3 years of keeping kids off the streets, teaching them basketball, helping with homework. Some of those kids saw what happened today. How do I explain that to them?" Reynolds felt tears building in his eyes again. "I forgot everything I was taught," he admitted. "Everything your grandfather taught me." The room went quiet. The teenager's mother stepped forward. "You knew Captain Thompson." "He was my mentor at the academy," Reynolds said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He taught me that being a police officer was about serving the community, about building trust. Today, I betrayed everything he stood for." The teenager sat up straighter. "Grandpa used to tell me stories about training young officers," he said, "about trying to change the system from within. He believed it was possible." He looked at his parents, then back at Reynolds. "I still want to believe that." His mother spoke up, her voice firm but not unkind. "My father-in-law spent his whole career trying to bridge the gap between police and community. My son has been trying to do the same thing in his own way. Now here we are." The social worker in the corner shifted slightly, pen poised over her notepad. This conversation would likely be part of multiple reports: internal affairs, civil rights investigations, community relations. But right now, none of that mattered as much as the human connection being formed or broken in this room. "I was thinking," the teenager said, sitting up even straighter despite his obvious discomfort, "maybe this could be more than just another incident report. Maybe it could be a starting point." His father looked surprised. "Son, you don't have to." "But I do, Dad," the teenager interrupted. "Those kids in my program, they need to see that change is possible. That when something bad happens, we can work to make it better." He turned back to Reynolds. "I'm not saying I forgive you. Not yet. But I am saying we could use this to make a difference." Reynolds found himself holding his breath. "What are you suggesting?" "The community center runs police youth dialogue sessions," the teenager explained. "But they're always formal, stiff. Nobody really says what they're thinking. But what if we shared our story? What if we showed both sides, what went wrong and how we're trying to make it right?" His mother stepped closer to the bed. "Are you sure about this?" The teenager nodded. "Grandpa always said that real change happens through honest conversations. Even the difficult ones. Especially the difficult ones." Reynolds felt something shift in his chest, not relief exactly, but perhaps the first glimpse of a way forward. "I don't deserve this chance," he said honestly. No, you don't, the father agreed, speaking for the first time since entering the room. But this isn't about what you deserve. It's about what our community needs. The social worker was writing faster now, probably recognizing that something unexpected and important was happening. The steady beeping of the monitors continued in the background, marking each moment of this turning point. I want to be clear, the teenager said, his voice growing stronger. This doesn't make what happened okay, it doesn't erase it. But maybe we can use it to prevent it from happening to someone else. His little sister, who had been quiet by the door, finally spoke up. Will the other kids come back to the program? The question hung in the air, heavy with all its implications. Would parents still trust their children to play at that court? Would the community heal from this breach of trust? Would anything really change? The teenager looked at Reynolds, his gaze direct and challenging. That depends, he said. Are you ready to do the real work? Not just say sorry, but actually help make things different. Reynolds stood straighter, feeling the full weight of this moment. His answer here would matter, not just for reports or procedures, but for real people, real lives. Yes, he said simply. I'm ready to learn, to change, to do whatever it takes. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the heavy silence of accusation or shame, but the thoughtful silence of people considering a new path forward. Outside the hospital room, the everyday sounds of the emergency department continued, phones ringing, people talking, life going on. But in this room, something important was taking shape. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first step toward healing for everyone involved. 2 weeks after the incident, the Thompson Community Center's main hall was packed. Folding chairs filled every available space, and people stood along the walls. Parents, teenagers, community leaders, and police officers all gathered for what the flyers had called an honest conversation. The teenager sat at the front table, looking stronger now, though still occasionally rubbing his eyes, a lingering effect of the pepper spray. Next to him sat Officer Reynolds, out of uniform, his posture showing both discomfort and determination. The crowd's murmuring carried an edge of tension. Thank you all for coming, the teenager began, his voice steady. I know many of you were there that day at the basketball court. Some of you recorded it. Some of you helped me. All of you were affected by it. He paused, looking around the room. But we're not here to relive that moment. We're here to make sure it doesn't happen again. Reynolds watched as kids from the basketball program filed into the front row, led by the teenager's little sister. Some of them couldn't meet his eyes. Others stared directly at him, their young faces full of questions. One boy clutched a basketball like a shield. 2 weeks ago, Reynolds spoke, his voice shaking slightly. I made a terrible mistake. I let fear and prejudice override my training, my judgment, and my humanity. I hurt someone who was doing nothing wrong, someone who was actually making our community better. A mother in the audience stood up, her voice tight with emotion. My son was in the youth program, she said. He used to dream about being a police officer. Now he's scared to play basketball. How do we fix that? The teenager leaned forward. That's exactly why we're here. Officer Reynolds and I have been talking, really talking, about what happened and what needs to change. Not just policies or procedures, but hearts and minds. He gestured to a stack of papers on the table. We've developed a new program. It's not just about police coming to play basketball with kids, though that's part of it. It's about real relationships. Officers will spend time at the community center, not as authority figures, but as mentors, tutors, fellow community members. Reynolds added, and officers will learn from the community too. I've learned more in the past 2 weeks, listening to this young man and his family, than I did in 8 years of patrolling these streets. An older officer in the back spoke up. What makes you think this time will be different? We've had community outreach programs before. The teenager's father stood. Because this time, it's personal. This isn't about checking boxes or filing reports. This is about my son, who was hurt but chose to turn that pain into purpose. About Officer Reynolds, who could have hidden behind procedures but chose to face his mistakes. About all of us choosing to do the hard work of real change. A young boy raised his hand. Will you still teach us basketball? He asked the teenager, his voice small but clear. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the teenager smiled. And now, sometimes Officer Reynolds will help too. After he learns how to dribble properly. A slight chuckle rippled through the crowd, breaking some of the tension. Reynolds managed a small smile, acknowledging the gentle jab. The teenager's little sister stood up. "I have a question," she said, looking directly at Reynolds. "What do you want to say to the kids who saw what happened?" The room went quiet. Reynolds stood slowly, facing the young people in the front row. "I want to say I'm sorry, not just with words, but with actions. I want to show you that when people make mistakes, even adults, even police officers, they can own up to them and work to do better. Your trust is something we have to earn back, one day at a time." A teen girl in a basketball jersey raised her hand. "What if other officers don't want to change?" "Then we keep pushing," the teenager answered. "My grandfather used to say that change is like a basketball game. You don't win in one play, you win through persistence, teamwork, and never giving up even when you're down." The community center director stepped forward. "We've already had 10 officers volunteer for the new program. They'll start next week, joining our youth activities not as authorities, but as partners." Reynolds added, "And I'll be taking additional training in de-escalation and community relations. But more importantly, I'll be here, learning from all of you, especially the young people who've shown more wisdom and courage than I did." A local pastor stood up. "This is a start," he said, "but we need commitment. Real, lasting commitment." The teenager nodded. "That's why we're documenting everything, the good and the bad. We'll share our story with other communities, other departments. What happened to me was wrong, but if we can use it to create real change, then maybe some good can come from it." As the meeting continued, people began sharing their own stories, times they felt afraid, times they felt misunderstood, times they wanted to build bridges but didn't know how. The atmosphere slowly shifted from tension to cautious hope. Outside, through the community center windows, the basketball court was visible, empty now, but waiting. Tomorrow, it would fill again with young players, their bouncing balls and laughter a reminder of resilience, of community, of the possibility of change. The meeting ran late into the evening, but nobody left. This wasn't just another community forum, it was the beginning of something real, something honest, something that started with pain but could end with progress. 6 months later, the Thompson Community Center basketball court was alive with activity. The autumn air was crisp, but nobody seemed to mind the cold. Kids of all ages ran drills while parents watched from the bleachers. But what made this scene different from 6 months ago was the mix of people on the court. Officer Reynolds, dressed in workout clothes, was helping a group of younger kids practice their passing. He'd gotten better at basketball, though the teenager still regularly reminded him about his first awkward attempts to teach dribbling. The kids no longer flinched when they saw him. Some even high-fived him when they made a good shot. "Keep your eyes up when you dribble," the teenager called out from the other end of the court, where he was working with older players. His voice was strong and clear, no trace left of that horrible day 6 months ago. He'd grown into an even more respected leader, not despite what happened, but partly because of how he'd handled it. The community program they'd created together had exceeded everyone's expectations. What started as a response to a crisis had grown into something remarkable. 3 times a week, police officers joined the youth programs, not just for basketball, but for homework help, mentoring, and real conversations about life. A news crew was setting up their equipment near the court. They were doing a follow-up story about how one incident had sparked real change in police-community relations. The teenager's father, watching from the sidelines, smiled as his son confidently approached the reporter. "It's not a perfect happy ending," the teenager told the reporter, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We still have work to do. But look around, 6 months ago, nobody would have believed this was possible." The camera panned across the court, showing officers and kids playing together, parents chatting with police supervisors, and young people feeling safe in their own neighborhood. The transformation wasn't just in the programs, it was in the small moments, the casual conversations, the gradual building of trust. Reynolds watched from his corner of the court as the teenager handled the interview. He remembered their first real conversation in that hospital room, how uncertain everything had felt. Now, they worked together 3 times a week, turning a moment of crisis into a movement for change. "Officer Reynolds," called a young voice. A small boy was tugging at his sleeve. "Can you show me that defense move again?" As Reynolds demonstrated the proper stance, he caught sight of a familiar face entering the court, Captain Thompson himself had come to visit. The retired officer moved slower now, but his eyes were sharp as ever as he took in the scene before him. The teenager spotted his grandfather and jogged over. The three of them stood together, the retired captain, the young community leader, and the officer who'd learned the hardest lesson of his career. 3 generations of change, linked by one moment that could have torn them apart, but instead brought them closer. "You know," Captain Thompson said, looking around the court, "in all my years on the force, this is what I hoped for. Not that nothing bad would ever happen, but that when it did, we'd find a way to make something good come from it." A young girl sank a perfect 3-pointer, and everyone cheered. Officers, kids, parents, all together. The sound echoed off the buildings around the court, a different kind of police siren, one that spoke of hope rather than fear. The teenager's sister, who'd become an important part of the program herself, was teaching younger kids about conflict resolution, skills she'd learned in the new youth police workshops. Sometimes, she told them, the biggest changes start with the hardest moments. As the evening wound down, parents began gathering their children. Officers helped pack up the equipment. The news crew captured final shots of the court, so different now from the viral video that had shown a community's pain 6 months ago. Same time Thursday, Reynolds asked the teenager as they put away the last of the basketballs. "You know it," the teenager replied. "Don't forget, we've got that speaking event at the police academy next week. Those new recruits need to hear our story." Their story had already traveled beyond their neighborhood. Other communities had reached out, wanting to learn how they turned a crisis into an opportunity for change. The teenager and Reynolds had spoken at conferences, shared their experience with other departments, and helped create a template for real police community engagement. But more important than the programs or the presentations were the daily moments, the trust rebuilt one interaction at a time, the fears overcome through understanding, the bridges created by simply showing up day after day and doing the work. As the lights dimmed on the court, Captain Thompson took one last look around. "You know what makes this work?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "It's not just the programs or the policies. It's the people willing to be honest, to be vulnerable, to believe in the possibility of change." The teenager locked up the equipment shed. "See you all next time," he called out to the departing crowd. Kids waved goodbye to both him and the officers, no difference in their smiles, no hesitation in their trust. Reynolds walked to his car, no longer in a patrol vehicle but his personal one. He'd learned that sometimes the most important police work happened out of uniform, in moments of simple human connection. The weight of his badge felt different now, not a barrier between him and the community, but a reminder of his responsibility to it. The basketball court stood quiet now, but it wasn't empty. It held the echoes of laughter, of honest conversations, of mistakes acknowledged and bridges rebuilt. Tomorrow, it would fill again with the sounds of a community that had learned the hardest lesson of all, that change is possible, even in the darkest moments, if people are brave enough to work for it.